So welcome from Brussels. The sun is shining here. So welcome at the Atelier Kampala, also for the people who are joining in the Zoom session. We are having a panel on festivals and social change. And the Festival Academy has been working on this for quite a long time already. To look at festivals, not only in how do we organize them or how do we produce them or which artists do we invite, but to really look at which role festivals can play in society. And we've done a couple of things like hotspots around Ukraine or Nigeria or Lebanon or Afghanistan, because we believe that we're all affected. We're interconnected globally and we're all affected by these conflicts. And we feel that in our livelihoods are affected by that. So what we've been aiming for with the Festival Academy is to create this kind of a solidarity network with 1,000 people from more than 90 countries that we have on board at this point, and to really see how through these connections and being aware of the issues that are going on in other regions and in other countries, and also the movements that have been rising in the past years, like Black Lives Matters or Me Too, how we can engage with those. So we have a couple of fantastic speakers who will give a kind of keynote inspiration around the topic, and then to see how we can advance the work that we are doing on that. So thank you all for being here, and Edima, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Inga. Thanks, guys, and welcome back. So this particular panel, follows from, the context that Mike, provided you this morning. The point is, as festivals, you don't exist in a vacuum. Your entire environment impacts you. And how do you use your festivals and to change narrative? So what we've done is we've brought together an incredible panel of experts who will be able to speak to this. And once they've all had a chance to speak, we will open the floor for questions so that this resonates with you a bit more. And it shows you how you can use your festivals to begin to change old narratives. So let me just introduce the panelists, and then we will start the conversation. So all the way from the US, we have Alvin Sparks from the Open Society Foundation, sorry. And then we have Yusuf Mahmoud from Sauti Busara and Music in Africa Foundation. We have Jessica Hagan from Africa No Filter. And here with me today is Luiz. Coradazzi. I mean, he's been with us, and the wealth of knowledge that he's shared. So we're going to start off with Yusuf. So he'll introduce himself, say a bit more, and then just go into his presentation. He would then be followed by Alvin, and then Jessica, and then we come to Luiz. Okay, so Yusuf, over to you.
Thank you, Edima, and greetings, everyone. My name is Yusuf Mahmoud. I'm the founder and director of the NGO Busara Promotions here in Zanzibar. Our flagship event is the annual Sauti Busara African Music Festival, which takes place in February. And I'm also the chairperson of the Music in Africa Foundation, which is behind musicinafrica.net and other great projects. So firstly, as everyone is really probably already aware, no two festivals are the same. Each one is different according to its programming focus, its audience reach, its geographic and cultural context. I think there's a tendency by development experts to gauge the impacts of festivals by their economic effects. And whilst these are important, I think we should never underestimate the other impacts, which might be less easy to quantify. For example, festivals empower artists. They offer platforms for expression, collaboration, and exchange. Festivals offer opportunities for women, for youth, for people from marginalized societies to share their stories. Festivals build respect for cultural diversity, social cohesion, unity and solidarity across borders. Festivals provide employment, develop skills, networking and trade. Festivals shift narratives and challenge stereotypes about Africa. Festivals keep cultural heritage alive. Festivals provide visibility for new material and emerging talents. Festivals are hubs for regional ecosystems, networks of interdependent technicians, actors from the public and private sectors, artists, managers, technicians, donors, sponsors, media, tourism and travel operators, with the audiences who are all from different ages and different backgrounds. Last but not least, festivals bring joy to a lot of people. Sauti za Busara is an annual music festival that takes place in Zanzibar every year in February, and I believe it's the unique mix of local, regional, and international artists and audiences who are the key to our success. Our main objectives are to support African musicians and related stakeholders and ensure employment opportunities continue to be available in an East African music industry that is connected and in exchange with other regions. Sauti za Busara showcases African music that is performed 100% live. We celebrate cultural diversity and offer platforms for collaborations, meetings, discovery, nurturing of new talents. While programming artists and recruiting crew members, we always give priority to women. We program all styles of music connected to Africa, from traditional music styles to Afropop, jazz, hip hop, reggae, and electro fusions. We also give priority to young and emerging talents who play live music that is unique and with cultural identity. This new generation, for example, in Tanzania, we have a style of music called Singeli. These new Singeli musicians, for example, keep our festival fresh, relevant, and exciting. We enjoy taking risks. We enjoy programming acts that relatively few people have heard of. And more often, these are the artists that subsequently get invited to perform at other events internationally, precisely because they are different and unique. Our policy has always been to keep the festival accessible and affordable for local people. Ticket prices vary according to nationality, with generous discounts for all Tanzanians and African passport holders. Pre-pandemic, the festival was attracting around 8,000 people per day from across Africa, from across Europe and beyond. And for the last 2 years, the numbers have been lower, with audiences in February 22, last month at around 4,000 people per day. Just in brief, wearing my other hat, I'm also very honored to be the chairperson of the Music in Africa Foundation. And as some of you may know, musicinafrica.net is the leading web platform dedicated to African music. It hosts thousands of profiles, artist profiles, news, reviews, biographies, gig guides, research documents, teaching resources, information on funding opportunities, and more. Meanwhile, Music in Africa Live offers financial support to operators for high quality performances to reach local and global performances, local and global audiences, through primarily digital means. The Music in Africa Foundation also runs offline projects, including instrument building workshops, stage management training for women, lobbying activities, and more. Finally, its annual showcase event is the Access Music Conference, which so far has taken place in Nairobi, in Dakar, in Accra, and Johannesburg. And in this region, we're really excited to say that the fifth edition will be in Dar es Salaam, here in Tanzania, during 24th to 26th of November, 2022. So we'll see some of you there. Yeah, going to more to the topic in hand. In Africa, music is life. As Baba Mal from Senegal once said, there is no reason when you make people dance that you can't make them think at the same time. In my country, you have to understand that for my people, music is not just about having a party or dancing. It is one of the most important means of communicating our history, our concerns, and our values. Sauti za Busara is Swahili. It means sounds of wisdom. So we're not only putting young men on stage to croon about flashy cars and fat-bottom girls. Rather, we provide a forum for artists like Didier Awadi, like Neka, Sampa the Great, Dandiswa, BCUC, Msaki, and many other artists who share great music with meaningful lyrics that speak truth to power. And the way they speak truth to power communicates profoundly, heart to heart, in ways our politicians are unable to even dream of. The theme for our last edition in February 2022 was amplifying women's voices. We're firmly committed to increasing gender balance in our festival, not only on stage for the artists, but also behind the scenes for the technicians and other operators. We're increasing the number of women in our crew year on year. Earlier festivals campaigned for environmental protection, spoke out against corruption, gender violence, and other issues. Although one festival alone cannot make great transformations to society, we believe it is our responsibility to promote dialogue, change attitudes, and encourage action for a fairer and more sustainable world. A challenge we all face regarding this is that embassies, donors, and sponsors have ever-changing priorities that seem to move according to trends. Rarely will they support festivals per se. They usually prefer development projects, campaigns, and so on. But as event organizers, I believe we have to be careful and not get too distracted by the ever-changing demands of donors and sponsors. Their insistence on development messages or product advertising can be boring for audiences. In the New World Order, the inequality gap is increasing when it comes to vaccinations and freedom of movement. The super rich are getting even richer at the expense of the global majority. Since the pandemic, restrictions on social gatherings and travel have led to unprecedented losses for artists, for event organizers, and everyone else. Almost everyone else. Among new challenges are even scarcer funding for the arts, travel complications, additional expenses for organizers for PCR tests, audience security, health and safety procedures, and so on. Finally, I think it's important to say Sauti za Busara is possibly the only major festival that actually took place in Africa in real life, physically, during 2020, 2021, and 2022. Of course, the pandemic brought many challenges, including pressure, which we received many, many times from European embassies to postpone or cancel the event. Although we received those phone calls, letters, and emails and insistence to postpone, our local authorities were completely supportive. We did go ahead with the festival every year for the last 3 years, but to put it mildly, it wasn't an easy ride. I think one positive outcome is now that we partner, one positive outcome of the pandemic, excuse me, is that we now partner with more TV and online broadcasters to ensure that artists participating at the festival continue to reach wider audiences across Africa and beyond. However, it must be said, in East Africa, very few musicians actually get sustainable income from TV, radio, and online broadcasts. So I think there's a lot to be celebrated about the new digital opportunities and hybrid models for engagement. But whilst virtual concerts can be enjoyed at home, finally, I think it's impossible to replicate the magic, the excitement, and the energy of the physical festival experience. I'm sure we'll talk more in the questions and answers, and I look forward to more discussions. And great to meet you all, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. And so we move to Alvin.
Thank you, and Yusuf, that was very inspiring, and I took copious notes. I'm a little embarrassed to follow after you, but I will try. Hello, everyone. My name is Alvin Starks. I am the director currently of the equality team at the Open Society Foundations. Some of you may know of the foundation, which is a global human rights foundation around issues of democracy. Part of my work as director, I will be shifting over into a new body of work that's called narrative and culture. And so for me, I am going to give a perspective from a funder. It's definitely, I think, a different lens than individuals who are at, I think, the content-driven space that you all occupy, which I think is really rich. And so what I'm hoping I can do in my brief remarks are actually connect spaces that people oftentimes don't think about. And that is the relationship of democracy in place, the relationship of democracy and festivals. And so in thinking about this conversation, which I must admit was really exciting and a bit challenging, I came up with the concept that I would love to hear your feedback on, and I'm hoping this is much more of a conversation than anything. And I want to talk about the power of placemaking. The power of placemaking, because when I think about the role that festivals actually do, they actually are very powerful testimonies to the importance of placemaking. And I see them in 5 or maybe 4 categories. One, the radical notion of gathering historically has always been an antecedent to how democracies are created. Whether or not individuals went to sacred grounds such as religious faith organizations or social justice settings or music festivals, those were oftentimes the architectures. Those were the spaces where the inspirational seeds were planted. It's actually so important to remember that even the act of gathering was radicalized by authoritarian regimes because there was deep fear in actually seeing people sharing ideas and, dare I say, creating new cultures, right? And I think that's what the festivals are also doing now. You are constantly creating new cultures. So the first tenet for me was really recognizing that this is really the practice of culture making. This is a radical opportunity to bring in individuals, to see themselves, to share ideas, both in not just the enjoyment of art, but the belief in a society that is oftentimes different than the ones that they're living, right? Secondly, I think it's also about the creation of belonging, right? Belonging in a sense, because oftentimes festivals and gathering places have been instruments where people found their community. They found identity, right? They found a sense of source of cohesion that oftentimes is hard to navigate exclusively as an individual, right? It's a space of belonging in the sense that people found themselves as being more than just one person, right? I think we all have very big imaginations when we were possibly in a crowd and thought to myself, my God, I found my tribe. Where have you been? And that was overwhelming, right? That was an overwhelming response. And what we are seeing, right, if we were to be very honest in the human rights frame, we're seeing movements being created, right? You are creating another part of a glorious movement that is pushing the boundaries of humanity to be much more inclusive. Thirdly, I think about this as a space of networking, right? This is also the immense importance of in-person networking. I am sorry that I cannot physically be there now, but even in our breakout room, there was an opportunity before this conversation when we realized that there were so many intersections, right, that we just had not thought of before. And I think networking is actually where festivals almost predate where technology has actually brought us, right? To really understand common threads, spaces that we can actually mutually think about, projects. The kind of concept of an open source is also really radical in the networking space. So yes, I think there are ways in which, you know, the festival producers, artisans are actually, and technicians are also doing work around networking. But I also think that there's an underlayer of people who attend these festivals who are also networking that we just oftentimes don't have sight of, right? Like this kind of, so this question of impact, right, is something that I think as a foundation, I'm always being asked, like, how do you really assess the impact? You know, I think I met Inga maybe 3 years ago, right? I had no idea that I would be here today, but that relationship is still in play, right? So I think that's an important part to remember. Lastly, I also feel that these festivals or these gatherings, as I like the word gathering, I must admit, the power of gathering, really provide a place for creative dreaming and inspiration that oftentimes are inaccessible in civil society, right? They are the spaces where people expand what they believe humanity can be. It's a place where people explore history. It's a place where people really gather to really address common humanity threats, be they around persistent colonization, racism, persistent economic inequality, or even health consequences. So I think that that ability to really create those creative spaces for communities is awesome, but oftentimes unregulated in a way that allows people to think outside of the box, right? So again, the power of gathering. And I think these are all very powerful interventions towards the development of democracies. I had mentioned the notion that festivals or gatherings actually predated technology's ability to create networking opportunities, right? These are the places where participants had the ability to really create connections with one another. And this is bigger than just the cultural producers or the technicians or the funders, but actually audience, right? I also like to think about audience in a very different way. I think audiences are really communities, right? You have crafted communities. You have essentially become an organizer, right? You are organizing new modes of networking that did not exist before, right? That's incredibly a big element of power making when you are doing this work of place. Then I went to the section around creative dreaming, right? Oftentimes, festivals are those sacred spaces in civil society where dreaming is allowed, where dreaming is permissible, where exploring the antecedents of art, history, politics is celebrated in ways that civil society oftentimes does not allow. If anything, what I love about festivals is that they actually allow uniformity of access, right? It allows a way in which we are restructuring, dare I say, caste systems, right? Everyone gets a chance to at least for a moment be somewhat equal, right? And that's what we get, that people learn from these places of culture. Everyone has a mutual opportunity to explore and express themselves without the hindrance of, you know, other indicators that would have actually made them excluded. So I was also mentioning that I believe that festival making is essentially the power of gathering, right? And to sort of ground us in a moment, in a social justice moment, these gatherings are a huge threat to authoritarianism, right? Let's be very frank. Authoritarianism really requires itself to attack culture. It has to attack those spaces that are dreaming radically, right? And so for me, as someone who's a part of a human rights foundation, I completely understand and celebrate the importance of these sacred spaces that we're calling festivals, right? Because they are doing all of the important work of reshaping civil society, expanding the aperture of opportunity in ways that had not been thought of before, right? So there's a lot of grace in this that I also want to make sure that we recognize. And then, not lastly, but another element that I want to share, because we had mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, which we've had a chance to be supportive of inside our foundation. And even groups like the 1619 Project, which I think has opened up a lot of controversy in the US around how slavery created or has been a part of the democracy that we currently experience. Much of the 1619 Project, when it first came out, you could pick up a copy of the 1619 Project that was produced by the New York Times at Afropunk, right? Which, as some of you may know, which is a fantastic festival of alternative Afrofuturism. And people probably wouldn't think about the 1619 Project being at Afropunk, right? But at that festival, and I think this is true to many festivals, there was a complete, I think it was a social justice alley is the name they called it, right? Where one not only gets fed from the culture of music, but also gets politically fed because there are social justice organizations that are doing voter registrations, right? There are folks who are doing employment opportunities. It provides a space for medical attention, right? So again, you are really creating community. You are really in the milieu of real-time democracy making, right? So I just say that because when we think about festivals, I really challenge us to think of it as a part of creating democracy, as a part of expanding humanity, as opposed to an accessory, right? I won't go long into the space of narrative, which I'm very passionate about and would love to have more conversation about, but I do want to end with a quote from someone who I completely admire and love, the American civil rights artist and writer, James Baldwin. I'm always inspired by his work, and in particular, the role of art or artist. And he has this quote that I'll share, but I'll also read it really quickly. The precise role of the artist then is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through that vast forest so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it over to Jessica.
Jessica?
Fantastic. Thank you, Alvin. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. So my name is Jessica Hagan. I'm the Arts and Culture Lead at Africa No Filter, based in Accra, Ghana. And it's an absolute honor to be here today and to be part of this discussion with such great panelists. I will be speaking about owning a narrative, but before that, I'd love to just talk a bit about what Africa No Filter does and how it so greatly relates to the work of festival managers and producers. I'm going to share my screen. It's going to be a very, very short presentation. I hope you can see my screen. Fantastic. So just a bit about Africa No Filter. So we are primarily a grant-making organization, and our goal is to shift narratives about the continent and essentially to push in more contemporary, accurate narratives about Africa and Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. Our overall goal is to see a world where the prevailing narrative about Africa reflects the dynamic, innovative, creative continent that Africa is, and also the beautiful nuances that exist between countries, cultures, and individuals. There are several strands to our work. We, give grants to storytellers in the arts and culture sector, in the media sector, and also in research. We also conduct research. We have disruption projects and community building, such as academies and masterclasses and small workshops. We believe that there is a persistent and harmful narrative about the continent, the idea that Africa's broken, it's dependent, it lacks agency. There are harmful narratives about aid, about corruption, about HIV and AIDS. There are so many narratives, prevailing narratives about the continent, which are not truly reflective of the continent. So essentially what we do is we try to push out these accurate narratives about Africa. And we do that through the kind of 4 pillars that I've showed you. So we have inputs, we have time, we have the time to do this work. We have money from our funders. We're fortunate to be funded by quite large funders based in the US and in the UK. And of course, there are so many discussions about where funding comes from, which I will get into towards the end. And then of course, we have our voice. And so we have a really, really strong theory of change, which looks at our inputs, our outputs, and essentially what our outcomes will be, which will allow us to measure our impact. So we want storytellers who are skilled, trained, and equipped to push out that work. We want them to have a network so that they can collaborate across borders, which I will get into more when we talk about the importance of festivals. We are primarily a grant-making organization, but our primary goal is to see a world where prevailing narratives about the continent are reflective of a dynamic, innovative, and evolving continent. And so a lot of our work, in fact, all of our work goes into pushing accurate narratives and stories about Africa. We do this under we have 4 pillars in which we do this under, which is our grant making to arts and culture organizations and media organizations, and also some researchers. We conduct research, we fund research. We have disruption projects and community building, which is all about, academies and webinars and access to knowledge. Our overall goal is to see and to leave an empowered narrative about the ecosystem. I'm going to go quickly to the next slide. So there are so many negative, harmful narratives about the continent. The idea that Africa is both broken, that it's dependent, that it lacks agency. We hear stories about corruption. We hear stories about aid. We hear stories about, about war. We hear loads of harmful, negative stereotypes about the continent, which don't accurately reflect the entirety of Africa and the nuances that exist between countries, cities, tribes, and individuals. So we have a really, really clear theory of change, which I will speak about later when I get to the end of the slide. But our input, so we have time, we have money from our funders, and we have a voice. So about our inputs, we have time, we have money, and we have our voice. We're speaking about the fact that we have phenomenal funders. Our funders are primarily USA based, and I think we have 2 UK based funders, which I will speak about further when we speak more about the importance of festivals. And then we have our outputs, which I described earlier, and our outcomes, which we use to measure our impacts and to ensure that the narrative shifting work that we're trying to do is being done successfully. So we want to have storytellers who are skilled, trained, and equipped. We want to have storytellers who are networked, which festivals do, so that they can collaborate across borders, who are informed. Through our research, they have access to our data-driven insights, to our research and our knowledge, connected to markets, so they can build sustainable business models, especially when we look at the arts and culture sector, the importance of distribution and providing channels for creatives to be able to distribute, or storytellers to be able to distribute their works. Through our outputs, we have really, really clear outcomes, and this should always be kind of like what we refer back to ensure that impact is being made. So we want storytellers who are skilled, trained, and equipped. We want them to be networked, so they can collaborate across borders, to be informed. So through our research, they have access to data-driven insights and are able to use that to push more narratives and to push their work. Connected to markets, which especially for arts and culture means distribution. You know, what distribution channels are we providing for this content to be pushed out into the world and to be supported, amplified, and mentored, which we do through a lot of our community building and some of our other fellowships and programs. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and then I'll stop sharing my screen. So we have quite a few festival grantees, such as Lit Fest, we have Africa Podcast Festival, we have Lusaka International Film Festival, so different festivals, both in the arts and culture and media sectors. And then lastly, Y Festival. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to speak about the importance of festivals in owning a narrative. So we know a narrative to be a spoken or written account of connected events. So a narrative is made up of several different stories which collectively come together to tell one story, or to push one vision, or to tell one narrative. And so in order to shift a narrative, you have to make sure that the stories are connected and are connected in the right way, going towards the same direction. That's exactly what festivals do. They are a platform for several different people, different components, to come together under one vision, to come together under one narrative. And so in order to really be effective for social change, before you launch your festival, you must consider, what is the primary goal and aim of this festival? What is the primary theme of this festival? Why do the people sitting or performing or showcasing under this festival connect? What is the one thing that is going to connect them? Is it that they're all filmmakers? Is it that they're all musicians? Is it that they're all a particular genre of music? It must be connected. If I think about the festivals I go to, I may not like, for example, like a creative festival, I may not like everything that is programmed, but I understand that essentially they're meeting a shared goal. So a festival essentially is an opportunity for storytellers to come together and share what is important and meaningful, meaning as a producer or an owner of a festival, you have essentially the power to drive the social change and to set the agenda. The reason I spoke about funding is, when we speak about driving social change and setting the agenda, you also have the power to decide who is going to be associated with your festival and who's going to be behind your festival. I know in a time, especially for those in the creative industry, we're constantly worried about funding and money and how can we execute and still make sure that we can afford it. How do we have to not cut costs and cut corners? And there's often the temptation to accept funding from organizations or companies or individuals that don't align with your shared goal. And it's really important to decide what your shared goal is, so you can reach out and identify funders who align with that. festivals are powerful in that it builds the ecosystem, not only through the people you're programming at the festival, but through your attendees. The opportunity to connect, the opportunity to discuss, the opportunity to mind map ideas can all be had within the festival space, can all be had intensely within the festival space. And so often it's your priority and our priority as owners of narratives to make sure that spaces are as fulfilling as they can be in order to meet the agenda and to push social change in the best way possible. Of course, they provide visibility. And so with providing visibility, what is the primary narrative that you want to be told? When we look at Black Lives Matter, and we've seen, I think Alvin touched on it about, Afropunk and various different festivals that have decided that these festivals will now become tools for social change. When we speak about them, how do they do that? There are different ways to do it, and there are innovative ways to do it. No two festivals have to look the same. Is it by primarily programming Black artists or Black storytellers, or is it about fundraising on the side? Is it about further conversation? So how much innovation can you put behind driving your narrative, from your theme to your funders to the people you're programming to be a part of your festivals? And lastly, I want to talk about experiences beyond entertainment. Setting a theory of change about what your desired positive outcomes will be, which I think I demonstrated in the third slide. Aside from an intense 4 days where everybody's happy and elated and empowered and confident, which is a great outcome, how are you measuring the impact? How are you ensuring that positive outcomes are made? How are you holding yourselves accountable? How engaged are you with the storytellers as part of your festival? And what are their theories of change? So outside of putting on a great event, there's such a need to self-organize and to plan in order to ensure that your activism is not performative, but it is actually effective. So I will stop there, but essentially, just to go back, it's all about owning a narrative. What is the narrative that you want to own in your festival? Determine that from the beginning and allow that to influence and inform your selection process, from programming through to funding, even down to the dates that you're choosing to do your event, and the organizations that you partner and engage with. Thank you very much.
So we now move to Luiz, who is in the room with us. So Luiz, over to you.
Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank for the privilege of sharing the panel with the three of you. I think the work that the three of you do, I think it's beyond inspirational, and I would call it aspirational. And I think the impact that you deliver and the mission you took upon yourselves should be a shared mission for everyone in this room and beyond. So thank you for sharing your trajectories and your ideas and your values with us. And having said that, and because this panel is supposed to be focused on contemporary discourses, I would like to share a fact that I don't usually highlight in my resume, but my background, my first graduation was in marketing and communication. And the reason I don't highlight that much, because I consider myself as a cultural manager and enabler, is because for me, marketing is a set of skills that are the means to an end, is not an end on itself. And I use a lot of marketing tools and marketing-driven techniques to achieve my goals as a cultural manager. And this marketing and communications that are obviously all about discourse. They are all about narratives. They're all about messages and how to convey that message to your target groups or target audiences. And having said that, and because we're talking about narratives, I would like to take the conversation up a few steps in the ladder to what I think, what I can consider like the highest instance of existence, which is the official narratives of states, state nations. And because I spent a lot of time in the cultural relations, international cultural relations field, I think I speak from a vantage point here. As many of you know, I spent several years of my career working as the Director of Arts at the British Council in Brazil. and I get into more detail later on. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because what I think, as I said, is the highest possible level to convey a message from. And countries and nations and states, they do communicate, they do engage with external audiences, both internal and external, of course. And this is what we call, as we discussed yesterday, in our case, here is the cultural diplomacy or soft power, which is the set of techniques that states or even cities or provinces use to create or exert influence over or connect and exert influence over other people, neighboring countries, or even countries with which they do not hold friendly relationships. And that's been going on for many decades. As you know, many of these agencies, like the Goethe Institute and Alliance Française and British Council, where we are at now here in Kampala, they were created with the sole purpose of creating, improving reputations and building trust and trying to collaborate with people from a different place. And of course, that it was not always like this. Many of these agencies were created with the sole purpose of self-promoting the culture of their nation states. So it was really about, in the case of the British Council, for instance, funding British artists abroad. So they could go there, perform, or make an exhibition, or launch a book, or etc. And the message behind that, with a signature of the country behind that, is this is who we are, this is how we live. And I hope, because you are seeing who we are, you may like us a little bit more. And it's a long haul, it's a long-term investment. You do not create or improve reputations overnight. It's a big investment. A country investing in premises, staff, flying staff over to the ground. Here in the case of Kampala, there are people appointed in Germany to spend time here and getting to know Kampala better. But also, ultimately, this is really in their self-interest. Talk about themselves and why they could or should be a partner of choice, an ally, a partner for life, let's say like that. So as I say, the technique of evolving or developing these official narratives evolved over decades. And I think more recently, because the context, the global context also changed and very fast, it is now less unilateral. So it's less about self-promotion, but more about collaborating. And I can speak, of course, more about the British Council because I was there for many years, but I think more or less the same applies to every cultural agency. And let's just separate things here. British Council and Goethe Institute and the Cervantes, for instance, they are not governments, which means they have a relative level of autonomy in choosing the message, but ultimately they are representing a country, a state, a culture. So there is separation in terms of legal status and regulations, but ultimately we are talking about one nation and one peoples, a cultural sector or educational sector. So just to make that clear. For my personal experience, as you know, I've been at the British Council between 2011 to 2017, and I think it was the best possible ever time to be there because I had the privilege to lead on the Olympic handover. And of course, Olympics are not only about sports, they are about culture, and they are about trade, they are about influence, they are about reputation as well. So a big chunk of my job was to create the conditions and the networks to ensure that the London Cultural Olympiads had a legacy left behind it. One of the ways that we found to do that, to accomplish that mission, was to bring many of those initiatives and those messages about around the Olympics onto Brazil, and then after Brazil to Tokyo, and then to France, and etc. That was a way the UK sector found to give the investment on the Olympics a big afterlife and the legacy. So the timing, at the time it was the handover, the Olympic handover, but also a major governmental investment in a big marketing campaign. It was hugely backed by the government, the Great Campaign, which was really about this is our values, this is who we are. And I remember by heart some of those, some of their taglines or their main attributes. It was really pitching the Great Britain as open for business, human diversity as an asset. We like diversity. We are diverse and we like diversity. We are about collaboration. We are about exchange and mutuality. And this is not only by heart, I'm quoting from the campaign. The UK is creative and innovative. And of course, on the side of that great campaign and the British Council activity on the ground in Brazil, we had sister entities like Visit Britain promoting tourism. We had Education UK inviting people to study in English and Scottish universities. And after this big momentum, only a mere 4 years after that really beautiful Olympic ceremony that you must remember. Do you remember the London Olympic ceremony? It was about, this is how our people came to be. There were original people here, and then European settlement, and then the immigrants and West Indians and Africans and South Asians. And this is us. Everyone built this country. This is who we are now. Mere 4 years after that, what happened? Brexit. I think that was a very eloquent message to the world, to Europe, but also to the world. And to my point, the work done by the British Council, in my specific case, was about building trust and making sure the UK, Britain as a whole, was seen as the partner of choice to build meaning, to build wealth, to build prosperity. And what Brexit has done to that message, that was the result of decades of investment, decades being on the ground, getting to know local culture, but also speaking about themselves, of course. But Brexit denies everything that was built. Trust, friendship, collaboration, because let's face it, Brexit was not about economy. It was about xenophobia. Can we give things the right names? Okay. It was about xenophobia. So what could we do from that point in time? How can we sustain a discourse of collaboration, of diversity, of tolerance? When my country, back home, my people don't actually want you there. They don't want the immigrants there. So how do you, as a cultural manager, and even as a festival producer, because all the handover, the Olympic handover, and all the activity on the ground was ultimately a big festival. It was really the crossroads through which we could meet, we could understand, we could exchange ideas, and we could collaborate. So my main point is, when you represent a state or an organization or a state, an entity, and you are delivering the impact you promised to deliver, and then that institution or that entity confiscates the validity or the legitimacy of your discourse, what do you do? And I wonder, I think there are people here that are supported by government or international agencies. And I'm sure that many of you have found yourself in situations of conflict with your funders, of conflict with your backers. And in fact, this is something I want you to come up with your answers and experiences, because sometimes building a neat and solid message is not enough if the context is swept away from you. I would like to finish here with this reflection.
Thank you so much, Luiz. And I think that's going to take me to a question that I'd like to ask Yusuf, because there were, when you talk about contemporary discourse, globally during the, in 2020, 2021, and 2022, it was about lockdown, restrictions with COVID. However, in Zanzibar, where Yusuf is, the contemporary discourse was, how do we lift ourselves from economic recession? And, festivals like Sauti's Busara, were caught in that conflict. So I'd really like you to, speak to how you were able to manage that, because you said to us earlier that you had the embassies telling you not to have the festival, yet you still went ahead to have the festival because your community needed the festival. So how do you balance that, Yusuf?
Yeah, thank you, Dima. It was a tough time, honestly. It was quite an issue because, as Jessica mentioned, we are all to some extent influenced and relying on our donors and funders. And for the last 12 years, it's almost finished now, but we've had really generous support from the Embassy of Norway, the Norwegian embassy in Tanzania. They've supported Busara Promotions operating costs to keep going through the year. So without them, it would have been almost impossible to survive. And they were the ones telling us, or leading the campaign for all European embassies in Tanzania, including the European Union. They were really putting on the pressure. And this is after having had press conferences and combined press releases where everyone is saying this festival is so important and with the Europeans are proud to be supporting it, blah, 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 in January. Just a few weeks later, and literally 1 week before the festival, all these calls were coming in saying, no, Corona, you have to postpone. And we were saying, why? And they're saying, of course, because it could be a super spreader event and so on and so forth. This is in, we're talking about the 2021 edition, a year ago. So we had already basically spent or committed most of our budgets because the stage was already built, the venue was constructed, many of the artists had started arriving, we'd printed all the materials and so on. So if we had postponed, as they suggested, it would have been the death of the festival because we had no other funds to look to. But that wasn't the reason why we went ahead. The reason we went ahead was because our leaders from the Ministry of Health, from the Ministry of Tourism, right up to the president of the island, said, no, our policy in Tanzania is that we have no enforced lockdown and life has to continue and people have to survive. And of course, if people want to come, it's up to them. If people want to stay at home, it's up to them, which is why we had a lot more online and TV partnerships. But I think what I learned from this, one thing I learned came out, as Alvin said, he met Inga 3 years ago, and then these kind of fruits from networking and collaboration sometimes visible much later. But a year later in Johannesburg, a few months ago, we were at the Access Music in Africa conference. And a lot of the panelists in discussion there, who were African promoters and organizers and managers and festival staff and so on, they were looking to Tanzania as a kind of a role model or an example, and wishing that more African leaders would have followed our example. When it comes to the response to this contemporary issue of coronavirus. And I must say also that the festival did go ahead, 2020, 21, 22. There was, each of those years we did a lot of research with clinics, with hospitals and so on. We only heard of one case of one artist who arrived in Zanzibar the week before the festival negative, and when he got back to Lesotho was tested positive. We don't know if he was contracted COVID-19 in Zanzibar or not, but there were no serious cases or illnesses. So I think going back to African leadership, I really think we do need more responses that are locally relevant to these situations. Another the coronavirus is one example where Tanzania has really managed to survive and people have managed to go on with their lives and the festival managed to continue. I think another area that really needs to be discussed and changes made is in visa, because if Edema, I don't know if she travels on a Nigerian passport, but if she does, she would have problems coming to Tanzania unless she had done a lot of filling in forms and blah, blah, blah for 3 months earlier to get this special thing called referred visa. And it's the same for all of our artists from Senegal, from Mali, from many countries. It's really, really difficult. Whereas anybody from the European Union can just arrive to Zanzibar airport and get visa on arrival, no questions asked. So I think we need more African leadership, robust and independence in that area. I hope I responded to your question.
Yes, you did. Although I just wanted to also find out, was there any recourse for you having the festival in 2021, considering that your funders, didn't want the festivals to hold?
Sorry, Adima, was there any what?
Did you have any negative, negative backlash from your funders because you held the festival in 2021? Did you lose funders?
At the time, we were in serious danger of losing some of the funds that had been committed by the European Union and the Embassy of the Netherlands. Although they had already agreed in writing that they would fund projects within the festival, the money hadn't been received, and they were part of the people, of the campaigners to stop the event. So we did have trouble getting those funds, which were eventually paid after the event. But I should also say at the press conferences for this year's festival, a year later in 2022, those same European ambassadors and so on were congratulating us for going ahead. So at least maybe they learned that possibly we did the right thing, and certainly all the artists and audiences and people who were buying and selling and hotel rooms and so on were very happy, of course, as well.
Okay, thanks, Yusuf. I think I'm going to go to Jessica now. Jessica, so just sort of like following from what Yusuf has said, how do you, or your organization, how do you prioritize, discourse on the African continent versus that, which is global? And the reason why I'm asking this is because we have quite a number of African, participants here, and your organization, based on your introduction, is pushing, the African narrative. So how do we ensure relevant, discourse on the continent is supported, and so that these festivals know, where and what to support and, push forward?
Absolutely. I think, fortunately or unfortunately, the idea of relevance is so completely subjective. And so I guess I would largely just speak on African No Filter specifically. We prioritize young African voices. And the idea is not necessarily that we dictate the narrative that comes from those voices, but actually we put our money behind the voices that align with our goal and our mission. I think for organizations such as Africa No Filter, the greatest thing that we can, one of the greatest things that we can do is to use our money to amplify those voices. And we've seen a lot of, organizations. I mean, I also used to work at the British Council, specifically for West Africa. And so I have a very similar experience of working for organizations who have primary goals of pushing a country or pushing a reputation. or pushing pushing a country or a reputation, which essentially Africa No Filter tries not to do. And so in doing that, we look for young and emerging voices, and we look to put our money behind those voices. We try to prioritize Africans on the continent who are amongst communities and have created community. We look for self-starters, because the likelihood of funding a self-starter is that, you know, hopefully they're not being swayed by other funders or being swayed by, you know, other people in terms of perspectives. I think for arts and culture, 75% of our grantees are first-time grantees. So they've never received a grant before, they've never received funding before. And so essentially you tend to find that they're really fresh in terms of their perspectives, and they haven't started using the language that you would typically use to get within funding circles. And so you tend to find that voices are a little bit less filtered, which is only natural that it happens. And so for me specifically, diaspora voices are equally important, but it's recognized that they're completely different experiences. And so there's the understanding that there needs to be a balance of the two, but where funding through our research is not as common on the continent specifically, we are really, really driven to supporting emerging voices on the continent and from Africans who are living in Africa, working in Africa, and programming African events.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Alvin, you spoke about the power of placemaking. Can you maybe, expand on that? Because all the other powers you spoke of, very easy to, acknowledge and move forward. But with placemaking, I think if you could unpack that for our participants, I think that would really help.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So place is always political, right? We've mentioned things like Brexit, right? Which is about an entity removing itself from place, right? Whether we're talking about the narratives of Africa, right? We're talking about the narratives of place, right? Place is actually where people understand themselves, right? As a cultural producer, where I think many of you are who are attending this academy, you are at the rawest sense creating new places, creating new environments, creating new cultures, right? And that in itself is incredibly radical, right? And that's also powerful, right? To imagine the idea of creating, I don't want to say a new metaverse, but the idea of creating a new, right, sensibility, a new boundary, right, a new regulation of place is a significant cultural shift, right? And what's so interesting, just to kind of connect the dots, because you had mentioned COVID, it's what I think is so powerful about placemaking is the fact that as human beings, we all yearn to connect. We all want to be in some level of commonality, right? It is proven by science that people must engage. It's healthier to engage in person, right? So there's this huge health humanity benefit, right, to placemaking that we oftentimes don't own, right? And so I really think that we're at a place creatively where the construction of place deeply matters, right? And I also go back, and I mentioned this notion of belonging, right, is also really key. So I hope that helps to sort of animate.
Yeah, I think it does. That's really beautiful. Thanks. So coming, to you, Luiz. So we've talked about, the narratives that are global, the narratives that are local in a sense, and we're talking about placemaking and community. Now, with our participants here and your experience from British Council and what you're currently doing, how do you, with regards to whatever creative sector they're in, how do they pick some discourse to support and to drive, support and drive that message across? How do they do that? And keeping to the authenticity of their own festivals without just trying to replicate a narrative that everybody else is working on.
Right. Yeah, I've been thinking about I think it's two different axes maybe, or two different dimensions, because I was saying what a state nation can choose as its official discourse. And I think it's a valid proposition, but also it's something that they just do it. But on the other hand, and for good and bad, of course, but on the other hand, I don't know of any government or any state, maybe with the exception of North Korea, that dictates what culture, the local culture, should look like. Cuba was in that place for a moment, but even so, Cuban music and Cuban literature was not in the hands of government. So authenticity is something that arises from the soil, from people, not from the powers. So I wouldn't over worry about how to make these choices, because I think it's really a matter of looking around yourself and see what is making sense as a narrative at that particular moment, at that particular community. Not sure I'm answering your question without dodging too much.
I think you have touched on it, but I think what I'll do now is throw, the floor open to questions from the participants to our panel, so that it is, we are able to connect with, the amazing panelists that we have here. So questions, please. Oh, wow. Are you in shock? Okay, yeah. Okay, no, we have, yes, please go ahead. Go ahead, Shane.
Yeah, I didn't immediately want to ask this question because I'm one of the few participants from Europe, okay. But I am curious to learn. Maybe a question for Jessica, because you know both, like what in Europe as cultural makers can we do to communicate the African narrative that needs to be communicated with, knowing also, I guess you know the European context.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think what we found for years and centuries is the African narrative being told by Europeans and from a European perspective. And so I think there's a responsibility that when you're telling the African narrative, whatever that is or whatever form that may be, is to make sure that African voices are at the forefront. And if anything, you're providing the platform and potentially the audiences, but you are not driving the conversation and not speaking on behalf of, those who are authentically living that story or within that narrative. I think there's so much room for collaboration and so much room for shared learning. And I would always encourage cultural producers and festival managers and programmers to look at how you can co-collaborate, how you can work with, organizations on the continent or organizations led by Africans, and find ways to kind of do an exchange of work. And in doing that, because it's something that happens quite often, and I know, formerly when I was at the British Council, it's something we did quite often, exchange programs. Be careful with Europeans being the experts and Africans being the students. That's something that happens very, very regularly. And whenever I receive like kind of capacity building applications, I notice that is the pattern that contributes to the already harmful narrative. So make sure that it's an equal exchange and not one where, like I said, Europeans are the teachers and the experts and Africans are the students that must learn about the great things that Europeans have done or are doing. So those are some of the ways that you can do that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Jessica. Shade?
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the meaningful contributions. Maybe Luiz, you can start with this, maybe from whether it's a question of the authenticity of the message you were driving at British consul in Brazil being taken away that you left, but that's personal if you want to kind of address that. But I'm trying to connect it to where governments, or the powerful people try to control what narrative should come out of the things that we're doing, especially for some of us who are like upstarts, like not big time festivals, but small. And Idima, maybe you two can back me up on this. You know the governor of my state, he's always in the news. And I asked the other day at the National Theatre that they somehow try to stop my event in 2020. I didn't give you the whole gist, but it's this same idea of the powerful trying to control what we do, the narratives that come out in small places. Those in bigger places, maybe it's not that complex, but for those of us in small places, one thing can just make you cease to exist, especially if maybe regulation or sudden policy change targeting you directly, and by the time you recover, you're not able to connect again the way you were coming up. So how do we, I was hoping when Edima asked, this was my expectation from your answer, how do we navigate such tricky grounds where the powerful, maybe because of money or because of politics, try to control the narratives that should come from the small works that we do? Thank you.
Okay, I think this political context varies way too much for to be addressed as one single answer. But I think it's important to understand that governments are actually abstractions. They're not physical buildings. Of course, there's people inside and they call the shots, but the idea of a state, it's an abstraction. It's not, it's like an entity hovering over and controlling our lives. Yes, and it does that, but it's not really, you cannot personify a government, even though we have a chief executive and it's a head of state and etc. But they are abstraction. And my point is, I think you mentioned how to deal with city or state. I think it's just a lower level, but they are still abstraction. And I think the closest to you at the city level, in that case, is the closest to you, is where you can have maybe greater leverage. But apart from that, I think in order to handle or navigating, to use your word, navigating these complexities, I think your festival needs to create, to Edima's word, cultural capital, social capital, experiential capital, and make sure the festival is necessary and people will stand up for you. Society will stand up for your festival, or your stakeholders and your partners, and then you can demonstrate to whatever level of government you're talking about, you can demonstrate that they also should support, or at least they should not stay in your way. So, and easier said than done, of course, and it doesn't apply to every context, but I think it's just that it's important to see government as something abstract and not like a person that has a personal opinion about your festival or a stake on your festival as well.
Thank you so much. Joshua?
Okay, firstly, I have a question for Alvin, but I don't know if he's still there, but quickly speaking to what Shadrach just raised now, I think as artists or as creatives, festival makers generally, especially for people who run multidisciplinary festivals, maybe it's also relevant to begin to reimagine how we want to create our festivals, even when especially when we're able to access government fundings. From the side of Nigeria, for example, there are performance companies that would take money from the government to put up socio-political performances that would still abuse the government. And then while they are there, I think maybe it's in the crafting sometimes, or it's in the crafting. And then you find them all laughing over it, not knowing that the art actually is directed towards their misdoing or their undoing. So I think it's maybe our own job to begin to reimagine how we want to retell the stories in ways that will not totally block our access or availability of the support and funds that we get from them. And then in the light of this, I don't know if Alvin is still there.
No, Alvin, unfortunately, has, it won't be, yes.
Okay.
No, he had to leave. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's time.
Okay. Yes, please. Yes. No. Okay.
My question, I think, is for both of you, and in fact, everyone in the room, and might be quite a controversial one. But having been the person that hunted Afropunk down and dragged them onto Constitution Hill to have an Afropunk in Africa, as a privileged white old woman who's experienced the challenges of dealing on the diaspora and in Africa. Part of that honest experience is that African Americans are as racist towards Africans in their perspective initially as allegedly white South Africans are. Just in how you talk about the perception, Jessica, of looking down at Africans like we're stupid because our admin may not be as efficient as Americans, right? My question for you as a funder is there a long-term plan to deracialize how we distribute funding for Africans, or is African based on color? Because one of my biggest concerns is that repeating the past by marginalizing people based on color simply makes us the colonialists we're trying to fight. And that's one of the issues that we challenged Afropunk with in their original narrative of capitalizing on Black anger versus South Africa's equality clause, which is to bring together a society of diverse individuals heading towards the utopia we want to create. So it's a controversial question, but is it built into your long-term strategy that while we're creating platforms for voices of young Africans, is that color-based specifically, or is that third generation without melanin Africans too?
Thank you for the question. So just touching on, I think you mentioned something about African Americans and their kind of relationship with Africans on the continent. I think the conversation between diasporans, it's a really difficult and complex conversation, and a lot of that comes from, I mean, it's histories and years and years and years of hostility, of the losing of identity, of misinformation. And so I want to separate that particularly from this conversation. I wouldn't call it racism when we're speaking about African Americans and Africans. So I just want to clarify that, and that's a personal perspective. What I would say in terms of when I apologize for the noise, when we speak about Africa No Filter's long-term goal, we essentially, when we're supporting a organization or an individual, it's not just about the work that the individual is doing, but also about their community. And it's also about, you know, their contributions to the ecosystem and the community. I think when we funded, we haven't necessarily said that we are primarily funding Black Africans, but essentially when we speak about Africa, and we speak about Africans in this content, a majority of who we're funding are going to be Black Africans and are going to be Black Africans in Africa. And so just kind of, I don't think there's a targeted effort for us to only fund Black Africans and only fund first generation Africans. But I think in the work that we're doing and the voices that we're trying to amplify, and naturally, when we look at the percentages, we know that a majority of our grantees are going to be Black Africans. I hope that answers your question. And of course, I'm speaking from an organizational point of view. If I'm speaking about my personal perspectives, I think that would be a slightly different answer.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We have one last question from Samaju. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Mine goes to, the first goes to Jessica, and it's on how to deal with the issue of bureaucracy and the hidden truth of kickbacks, or which we might, in bold words, is more of a corruption involved in the issue of getting the fund, because there is a lot of bureaucracy and kickbacks from some officers in the funding agencies. Then other to Mr. Yusuf, the issue of dealing with as in staying true to your cause. For instance, you being bold and go on with the festivals in the 2 years, 2020 and 21. Like, how do you deal with that without even thinking of the repercussions of what would come from your funders, because they've told you, we don't want the festival to go on, but you go on with it because you have the trust of the state. How did you deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go first, Yusuf, if that's okay. Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, bureaucracy definitely does exist when it comes to funders, and I'd be very dishonest if I was to deny that, and to deny that that unfortunately funding spaces do have the tendency to be quite elitist and quite heavily based on who you know. And that's being completely honest. I've worked for several funding organizations and have been able to see that. What I would say is you should always ask funders what their selection processes are. I think you should ask for transparency, and you should kind of apply some type of pressure for that transparency. When you receive rejections for funding applications, you should see if you can get feedback. I know people have asked me for feedback before, and sometimes you feel like you can't because of the volume of applications that come in, but it will give you insight into how they're making these selections. That's a difficult route. The easy route is to start connecting with funders and start building those relationships and start having those conversations, or that could probably arguably be the more difficult route, but it definitely does exist. I think funders need to be more transparent about their processes, and they need to be more transparent about who they choose to give their money to and the process that they go through in order to give their money to. And then I think there needs to be pressure put on smaller grant-making organizations, or just grant-making organizations in general, to stray away from re-granting, which happens quite often, and actually to do the work to find new organizations. As I mentioned, for arts and culture, which is the department that I lead, are 75% of our arts and culture grantees are first-time grantees. And that's the reason that we did online call-outs, because we wanted to make sure that we were selecting people purely based on their applications and the work that they've been able to demonstrate. And it takes a lot more work in order to do that. I must admit, it takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more effort, it's extremely tiring, and there's a lot more risk involved, because essentially you're giving money to people that you struggle to be accountable for. But yeah, so put pressure on organizations to be transparent about their processes.
Thank you, Jessica. Yusuf?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Like I said, it wasn't easy organizing the festival for the last 3 years during this pandemic situation, but how do we keep focus? You know, we've been doing this now for 19 years, having a festival that is hugely popular with local people, people from the region and people from across the world come to Sauti Busara. We're very thankful for that, especially because we don't generally have big superstar headline artists like Wizkid and Burna Boy and so on, but people still come because they know they're going to have an incredibly amazing experience. When the festival is happening in Stone Town around Zanzibar, all the hotels are completely full, all the flights to the island are full, the people are selling food and selling arts and crafts, and you know, the taxi drivers, everyone is smiling basically, because you know it really brings a major impact to the economy. And even through the years of the pandemic, we were blessed. We never had a lockdown. Nobody was denying coronavirus existed in Tanzania. I know virtually everyone I know had coronavirus once or twice over the last few years. But people got sick and then they got better and life went on, you know, and that this is one thing that made us go ahead with the festival. And I don't want to sound like we were taking it lightly. I mean, we had temperature checks for everybody coming into the venue. There were every sanitizer and hand washing stations, and all the microphones and all the equipment were continually being sanitized. And, you know, we took it seriously, but it's somehow shocking for a lot of people, I think, not just in Zanzibar, but across Africa, that, you know, we were blessed. You know, Africa, some people passed away, some people got sick, but a lot more people die from malaria every day across the continent, and nobody's talking about malaria being this pandemic. And it's, you know, it's easily fixable. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You know, a lot of people die in traffic accidents and diabetes and all these other things. So we basically, I think, just followed the wishes of our people, who were continuing to gather throughout the time in other entertainment events, football events, churches, mosques, public transport. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Yusuf. Thank you. Okay, so we have, I know I did say it was one, Samiju was the last question, but being a co-founder of the Edema Foundation, I think, yes, Inga.
Just apologies, but Jessica has to leave as we are running also time. So maybe to, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, then I think we will, what we'll do, Jessica, we have a question for you, and we also had a question for Alvin. So we will send that question across.
I mean, I'm happy to answer if the person is ready. I don't want to.
We don't have any more time.
Okay, sure,
so
no problem.
The questions across, and if you could just kindly, you know, answer so that we can give them to our participants.
Definitely.
I'd appreciate that. So I think before we close out, I'd just like Jessica, starting with you, and then Yusuf and Luiz here, to just, you know, final words on, you know, festivals and contemporary discourse. What should be the takeaway for our participants? You know, just your, you know, elevator pitch to them. You know, what should be the takeaway from this discussion?
Great. Well, I definitely want to say firstly, thank you so much for having me. And it's been a really, really great conversation. And it's been really great to hear Yusuf and Luiz and Alvin. What I will say is that, as I was saying, as a cultural producer or festival manager or programmer, your voice is so powerful and so important. And it's not to be a cliche, but essentially you determine the discourse that will happen under the program that you're running. And so to start with that, and to think about your theory of change, think about your clear impacts and outcomes and outputs, and make sure you don't compromise on them, down to who you're programming to be a part of the festival, to your funders, to your partners. Make sure they are all aligned with the narrative and the story that you want to tell. And that's not to sound idealistic, because like I said, I understand, you know, especially when it comes to finances, that sometimes you just want money. But with every funder comes a desire, and with most funders come stipulations. And so if you compromise that early, you will be stuck, and you'll find that you may be compromising on your message, your theme, or your goal. So those are my words. And once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jessica. Yusuf?
Yeah, also big thanks to the other panelists, to everyone of the participants and the organizers. Thank you for having me. In short, my advice to everyone involved in organizing festivals is to build as many partnerships as possible with public and private sectors and other cultural or institutions, to have platforms like this where people can exchange and learn from one another and share information and so on is so important, as is networking locally and internationally. I would say to everyone, remember, whatever kind of festival you are organizing, it will be impossible to please everyone all of the time, but inclusion and diversity must prevail. And finally, I would say that, you know, as our brothers and sisters from Europe, in terms of their involvement in development and cultural activities across Africa, I would say, you know, that we must remember that a lot of these imported concepts from the West can and should be embraced. You know, when it comes to having quality sound, when it comes to having timekeeping, you know, there are professional things like health and safety of audiences and so on, we should embrace. And we don't have to compromise or sell out the uniqueness and diversity of our cultural heritage to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Luiz?
All right, coming back to my double set of skills, the marketing, communications, and then the cultural management. In marketing, as you know, we tend to highlight the strengths and good points of our products and service and somehow avoid unflattering angles. So try to neutralize the negatives or the weaknesses of our project. But on the other side, as cultural producers and enablers, my final words would be, do not be afraid of uncomfortable messages if they make sense to your vision. Do not avoid controversy. Do not deny negative spots that you can identify around you. And just to finish, festivals have a responsibility not only to have a solid, even though flexible, at the same time message, but also a mission to amplify other people's messages as well, because you are platforms, you are crossroads, you are amplifiers of voices. So that's it.
Thank you so much to this amazing panel. Alvin that has left us. We've learned so much and appreciate your time. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Participants as well.
Thank you, Jessica, Yusuf.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.